Mesdames et messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, many thanks for coming to this event. It shows that Brexit, or Frexit fatigue has not completely destroyed people. It's my great pleasure to welcome one of my French intellectual heroes, Emmanuel Todd, demographer, sociologist, anthropologist, polemicist even. Emmanuel's fellow of the National Institute of Demographic Studies in Paris. Now, he first came to international prominence at the tender age of 26 with his book, I give the English title, The Final Fall, an essay on the decomposition of the Soviet sphere, which, basing itself on infant mortality rates, predicted the demise of the Soviet bloc. Many thought that he was mad. He also was a vocal opponent of the Maastricht, sadly. He was also a vocal opponent of the Maastricht Treaty during the referendum of 1992. And it was around this time we became associated with the idea of la fracture sociale, dividing France. And this theme of a social fracture or gap was adopted by Jacques Chirac in his successful presidential campaign of 1995. Other books by our guest include After the Empire, The Breakdown of the American Order, and the highly controversial Who is Charlie?, Xenophobia and the New Middle Class. His most recent book, Lineages of Modernity, A History of Humanity from the Stone Age to Homo Americanus, is published next month by Polity Press. Some personal details. Emmanuel Todd is the grandson of the tragic communist writer Paul Nizan and son of Olivier Todd, biographer of Albert Camus and André Malraux, among other works. Our esteemed guest lives in the very posh suburb of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, and he has...
No longer,
oh, sorry. And
I was brought up there.
He now lives in Clichy-sous-Bois. And
my wife works in Clichy-sous-Bois.
Okay. So he's got social credibility here, and he has a
trying to sort of a catch-all system.
And he has he has a cat called Mozart. Now, I'm a distinguished scholar. Now, I mean, there've been a lot of Brexit brinksmanship about on the linguistic level, with Emmanuel threatening that actually didn't know a word of English, despite having done his PhD at Trinity College, Cambridge.
40 years ago.
40 years ago. But actually, he just learned a few words in his bed and breakfast during the afternoon.
Yes, I used the Berlitz thing.
Berlitz, that's right. So you're going to talk to us a bit about how you conceptualize Europe, is it? And then I'm going to ask you 5 questions related to Brexit and Frexit, and then we'll open, as true Democrats, we'll open it to the floor. Okay, so over to you.
Okay, I'll try to explain it. It's not simply the way I see Europe, it's the way I see history, so as not to sound completely mad when I talk about Brexit. And you see, otherwise I would be producing out of the blue propositions and so on. So I have developed a vision of history with in which politics and the economy are superficial, conscious layers in the development of things. I have a subconscious level, or what I call a subconscious level, which is basically the movement of education. So I'll give a quick example. I'm saying subconscious level for education because it's, well, people know education is important. While parents are terrified by education and want their children to succeed as best as they can. But and even the OECD now is monitoring with great precision academic performance in the various countries, and they know that according to educational performance, you'll have different economic outcomes. But they do not seem to realize that the development of education is the very axis of history. It's the moving force. And so, I'll give an example. This is very much derived from the work of Lawrence Stone, an English historian. It's the development of universal literacy led to revolutions and democracy, and to the more generally, or more theoretically, to the development of what I would call a democratic or egalitarian subconscious, because mass literacy produced fairly homogeneous societies in which, well, everybody could read and write, and not much else, apart from a few percent of the population able, well, having gone through some kind of higher education, private or public or anything. And this movement to universal literacy, in my view, was the driving force behind the inexorable rise of democracy in the West and elsewhere later. See. But then history continues, so to speak, and we've had, after universal literacy, we've had the development of well, secondary and higher education, which has led to a new or kind of re-stratification of society with perhaps, considering only younger generations, 30 to 40, or in some cases like Japan, 50% of the generation reaching or completing some kind of, well, complete higher education, and with another percentage of people with secondary education, and those left out with only a primary education. And in my view, this is the decisive thing which makes it possible to explain the emergence or re-emergence of an inegalitarian subconscious, because people on top or people with higher education have started living among themselves and really considering themselves as superior. It's easier in French because you'll say that people with une éducation supérieure will feel superior. It's easier. And in my view, this will be the most important factor. It's pretty clear now when you look at opinion polls, and whether you're examining the Trump phenomenon or Brexit or the Le Pen phenomenon, you'll see that the most efficient variable to explain the political differences will be education or educational level, much more efficient than wealth or anything. So that's one thing, and I'll have to use this when you talk about Brexit and even the Scottish referendum on independence. I'll need this, see? Yeah. Okay, and then, but, so, now there is an even deeper layer, which I will describe as completely unconscious, and that's the level of family values or family systems. This is my real trade, my real field of competence. I've been studying family systems all over the world for 40, 45 years. I can't even remember or give proper figures. But it appears that family systems all over the world and all over Europe have been very different for a long time. You see, you've got the nuclear family in England. I'm talking about the 17th or 18th century. I'm talking about peasants. So you will have a nuclear family without any specific rules of inheritance, or perhaps a little amount of primogeniture among the upper peasantry or something. But basically, wills is the important thing when you consider the English family. well, in the Paris Basin, you'll find what I call the egalitarian nuclear family. That's very close to the English system, plus a very strict rule of equality well before the French Revolution. You see, it's all already there in the 16th century, and probably goes back to the late Roman Empire, in fact. So these are the two, and here, well, I can already say that I've sort of generalized an idea that first produced by Alan Macfarlane, a very good English historian who was my external examiner at Cambridge, and who, you see, I mentioned Lawrence Stone, and now I mentioned Alan Macfarlane to make it quite clear that I never had a personal idea. I've reached the age when one wants to thank people rather than boast about things. So Alan first, in a sort of very short and decisive book called The Origins of English Individualism, first established the link between the English nuclear family and the English liberal tradition, and the plasticity of the the English and then the Anglo-American, in my case, Anglo-American social structure. So these are the two nucleotides. In the case of France, I will establish a link between the liberal element in French culture, but with equality added. So we have liberty and equality, and not just liberty and nothing else. And there we have an explanation for the close and difficult relationship between the French and the English. See, since the days of the French Revolution. Now we have, well, if we want to talk about Europe, we'll need two other family types. The most important one for what we are concerned with is the STEM family. The STEM family is try to imagine a development cycle where you start with a couple. This couple will produce children, and when the time of marriage arrives and when they must produce children, they will not go away, as in the English or French system, and found their own households. One child will be chosen, usually in 75% of cases it will be the eldest male, so we'll speak of male primogeniture, and the others will have to go away and find a solution. And you'll have, at some points in the development cycle of the family, you'll have 3-generation households, see, with grandparents, parents, and children. And of course, it's the value, the underlying values that are important, because the underlying values of the English family will be liberty or freedom, whatever you call it, and that's it, with the acceptance of differences between children. The underlying values of the French egalitarian nuclear family will be liberty and equality. But of course, the underlying values of the STEM family, the German family, or the Japanese family, which is structurally the same, or the family in southwestern France, it's all the same model. The underlying values will be authority, because you'll have really grown-up children still living under the authority of their parents. And inequality, not just differences between children, but inequality, because one will be the heir and the others will have to find a solution and will be nothing in the system. So, and this makes it possible to explain why the histories of Germany in the days of modernization turned out to be so different from those of France and England, and why Germany well, simply never accepted liberalism. It's a very simple explanation. I've had a lot of trouble because it's too simple. It works too well. My advice to students is never produce a theory that works too well. This will get you into trouble. See, being obscure and getting no results is safer. In the new academic system. Now the fourth family type. It's Alan McFarlane started from the English family. I, in fact, started from the Russian family. One day I had a vision of the map of communism as it looked like at sort of a moment of maximal expansion of communism. I'm talking about endogenous communism, not places where the Red Army had imposed communism. So I'm talking about Russia, China, Serbia and other parts of Yugoslavia, and even places or regions within Western Europe where the various communist parties reached rather good scores at free elections, like Central Italy or the western border, the Massif Central in France. In all these countries or regions, you will find a different type of family system. Again, you have to start from a couple. This couple will produce children, and all the sons will remain with their parents. Women, they will take wives from outside. The daughters will be sent outside. The system is exogamous. You're not supposed to marry a cousin or anything. And then you will produce children, and you will have, there I'm very specifically talking about the Russian family, you will have the emergence at some points in the developmental cycle of the family of enormous families spreading downwards, vertically, with 3 generations, and also laterally with several brothers. And of course, these, I call this, I made things simple for me, so I call this the community or communitarian family. But of course, the underlying values are authority, like in the German system, and equality, because brothers are equal, symmetrical in the system, and when the father dies, after some time, the brothers will separate and share equally what inheritance there is. So this is the kind of model, and one of the big surprises in my life as a research worker is that these big family systems have disappeared. There's nothing left of them. Of course, you will not find 3-generation families in Ruhr in Germany or in any German town, or very few anywhere. And of course, the community family has disappeared in Russia or in central Italy. But it seems my work on the various economic systems, on immigration, even on politics or educational performance, has shown, at least to me, that the values, or even if in an attenuated form, are still there, and they're still produced in the various countries of Europe, different political temperaments and different political attitudes and different ways of life. And this is the reason why in 1992, at the time I was working on immigration, and I had measured very different rates of mixed marriages for Pakistanis in England, for the daughters of Pakistanis in England, or for the daughters of Algerian immigrants in France, or for the daughters of Turkish immigrants in Germany. In those days, the UK, France, and Germany could be considered as comparable industrial societies, well, vaguely equal in terms of economic performance and standards of living. And there was no economic explanation for this difference, and there was no explanation in the differences between the several types, between the Pakistani, Algerian, or Turkish family. They're all patrilineal, endogamous. There are nuances, but basically the only way to explain these differences is a more relaxed attitude of the French towards mixed marriages, and a less relaxed attitude of the Germans. The case of England is slightly different between endogamy in the immigrant group. There was, well, extremely high. But so little by little, I started admitting that the idea of convergence of advanced society was complete nonsense, an illusion created by this very specific historical moment when Europe sort of caught up with the US and where the consumption society developed. And as soon as the going got rougher, national differences created by these different family values or surviving family values and different tempers, the temperaments and abilities and so on, would produce, this would produce divergence. And I immediately knew that the euro would be a complete failure. Immediately. And this was the reason, my reason for opposing the euro was not a priori or ideological or anything. It seemed to me completely unrealistic to imagine that you would unite nations that were already on the path of divergence. And so that I perceived the whole project as sort of metaphysical, thinking that a single currency could produce convergence. In my view, the historian or social anthropologist, was complete madness. And now, I'll explain shortly what this means for Europe now. And of course, France is a special case because it's the part of the Eurozone where individualistic or values should predominate, where a liberal tradition predominates. But if you consider, let's put it another way, it's not pretty obvious that the euro is an absolute economic failure. Well, everybody outside France knows this. You see, we've even got German reports on the subject, explaining that France and Italy are the major losers, not even Greece. This is the ultimate humiliation for the French bureaucrats, realizing that France is the great loser. We lost our industry because the French cannot be turned into Germans, and, which in my view is a very healthy thing. But if you think in terms of political values, And once you've realized that a majority of the family systems in the Eurozone, family systems that produce specific ideological or political traditions are not individualistic, not liberal at all. You see, northern Portugal will be dominated by the same family. This applies to the most developed part of Spain, from Galicia to Catalonia, including the Basque Country and so on. So there's the peripheral part of France, with also stem family types. In the case of Italy, you'll find a stem family in Venice, around Venice or Venetia. You'll have a community family system in the whole of central Italy, not very liberal either. And then you have the whole German-speaking world. Well, this would include Austria. Well, Switzerland is not, of course, not part of the Eurozone. And part of the non-maritime part of the Netherlands, you'll see that the stem family is the most important, or used to be the most important family system in not in Europe as a whole, but in the Eurozone. And so the underlying values of the Eurozone are authority and inequality. So if you add a Catholic tradition, which is often connected with the stem family, not always, but adds a few regions, if you had the community family values of the central Italy or the Baltic countries, which are very close to Russia in terms of family systems, well, I found peace admitting that the euro, certainly inefficient tool for the economy, but an instrument that successfully destroyed democracy. You see, because once the country has abandoned any kind of national, what we call sovereignty in currency matters, there's no such thing as democracy is possible. You see, there's no, even the President of France, Macron, has in fact no power. He's elected with universal suffrage, but he's powerless because France has lost the power of monetary or currency creation. So if you admit that the real goal of the euro was to destroy democracy, then you must admit that the euro is a complete success. The European Union, with at its core the Eurozone, no longer is a democratic system. You see, we use the words. It's one of these moments when you must be very careful about words, because you use the same words, but their meaning is changed. So look at what the EU was in the good old days of De Gaulle and Adenauer and so on. It was a community of, well, basically a community of free and equal nations. You see, what the underlying values of which were all very close to French values. But of course, with the first France and Germany a little more equal than others, and then Britain becoming part of the leading team, also a little more equal than others. But see what's happened since the reunification of Germany. We now have Europe. There's still a thing called Europe. There's still a thing called the European Union. but it's morphed into a completely hierarchical system where no vote ever counts. If you have a referendum in Greece, in the Netherlands, in Ireland at some point in time, in France in 2005, well, people can vote, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't count. You see, so you cannot. I'm trying to have you realize that these old Eurosceptic things against Brussels, the bureaucracy in Brussels are completely outdated. You see, because this refers to inefficiency, heavy procedures, but the truth about the European Union now it's that it's a completely, well, why not call it imperial, post-democratic system, you see, which sort of mixes with the undemocratic or post-democratic tendencies I suggested went with the development of higher education. And this is the situation now. And I think this is the moment when we must start talking about the meaning of Brexit.
So how do you, well, yes, I mean, time's flying, we'll have to get through these questions. I mean...
I'm very sorry.
No,
well,
you feel very strongly about it.
No, but getting a summary of a theory that took you 40 years to develop is, in 10 minutes is a little difficult.
No, you did very well.
Especially in foreign language.
So, I mean,
even worse.
As a Frenchman, I mean, did you welcome the Brexit vote, and how do you explain it?
Well, I'm not a typical Frenchman. You see, for one thing, I love democracy. You see, so this is not the real, and I do not believe in the power of words, and I admit the plain fact that France no longer functions as a democracy. You see, it's and of course because of the euro and the inability of any elected government to change course. I'm talking about Chirac, Sarkozy, Hollande, Macron. Well, the same policies will be carried out endlessly, completely inefficient, and so and now because of this, the political system. I'm not talking about the constitution and elections, but the party system has exploded, and now we have a decrease in standards of living, and now we got the gilets jaunes, and now we have to face the fact that the euro and what they call la construction européenne is in fact leading to the destruction of French society. So, now to the Brexit. The Brexit, to my type of Frenchman, is hope. Yeah. Hope, because I was pleasant. Well, I never thought the Brexit would win the referendum. I was already so depressed and so much in a mood of acceptance of the disappearance of democracy that I couldn't believe my eye. I remember myself waking up in the morning on my computer, reading the first page of the Guardian, Telegraph. And that was one of the most beautiful days in my life. You see, I still remember. I tell you exactly where I was sitting at the time, because to a Frenchman, to an anti-Maastricht, anti-Euro Frenchman aspiring to a return to national currencies, to some kind of friendly to everybody national independence, Britain getting out of the European Union would mean, well, first, the continuation of British liberal democracy, because this is it. You see, it's if you really get into the European system, you've got to abandon democracy or liberal democracy. I'm not quite conscious that perhaps we can talk about British attitudes or deep attitudes. I'm not quite conscious. I don't feel the British really know what's happening, in fact, completely know what's happening. And, but in my view, the Brexit could be extremely easy if internal forces within Britain had not, well, if Remainers had not made things very difficult, and with a terror campaign and so on, because well, the situation of Britain is really different. You see, I came to Britain yesterday, and already, Britain is still part of the European Union, and coming to Britain is very much like, in terms of procedure, passport control, currency. Well, coming to Britain is like going to Japan or the US. You see, you don't need a visa, but there's some control, and you must change money and get pounds, and then you have to face the local plugs.
Yes.
Realizing that you've forgotten your converter, you see, and this is what happens when you go to Japan. And things should, and tariffs around the European Union are very low. So it's just incredible that things are presented as so difficult, you see. France getting out of the euro would be something extremely difficult, but rarely the nonsense about the technical elements in the Brexit conflict in Britain is just incredible. So, in my view, Brexit, if accepted by Remainers, would have been extremely easy and would have been the beginning of the disintegration of the European Union. I'm talking as a Frenchman now.
Yes.
And because the British economy is much healthier than the French. The Eurozone is a disaster. Look at immigrants. They don't want to come to France. They want to cross the channel, you see? And this would have been the ultimate proof that we must get rid of the European concept, as it is now.
It's interesting, so you're already saying this would have been. So you say this would have been, so I get the sense that you're actually giving up on Brexit.
No, no.
But, and listening to you, it seems that Frexit is impossible as well.
No, Frexit is impossible if Brexit doesn't happen. You see, Brexit is a precondition for not Frexit, but complete disintegration of the Eurozone, which is, you see, but the fascinating thing in the situation is that how difficult things are presented or in Britain. So I'm quite sure that this isn't the problem. I mean, Remainers are sincere. They really want to remain, in a way, and it's but what they do not seem to realize is that they well, I'm sure that most Remainers are very nice people with very nice feelings, and they think they are motivated by incredibly beautiful universalistic values, you see, belonging to the world, the continent of Europe being an important part of the world, and I'm sure they do not realize that belonging to the European Union really means, well, giving up on liberal democracy, which perhaps is, well, the French are giving up on liberal democracy. We have a stratified society, stratified because of the new educational stratification. Educated people despise less educated people in France, and you must have similar things in Britain. So you must have some the drive to. I'm trying to be careful. I wouldn't be careful in France. You see, I'm well known as a raving maniac, able to say anything on Macron or on anybody, but this is Britain, so I have to be careful. You told me.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Politeness.
Yes. Yes. I'm as a well-educated foreigner, but there are some, like elsewhere, you must have some underlying post-democratic or forces in Britain. And I'll ask you another question. I'm getting
because we'll have to get. We'll obviously have to open the debate to our esteemed audience. I mean, briefly, the other Emmanuel Macron. Can he save the European project?
Well, he's already destroyed France. So perhaps you can trust him to save the European Union. This is no. He's no longer taken very seriously in France. So things are advancing at an accelerating pace in France, and but of course there's an enormous amount of control of the press and the media in France. It's not like here, where you have different views. French newspapers are incredibly homogeneous and similar in their conformity. It's just try, well, many of you are French, so perhaps you think that I'm talking nonsense, but just imagine a country where in terms of opinion or common values and choice, all newspapers read like The Guardian. It's a sort of complete uniformity. And so Macron is protected, in a way. He got scared by the Gilets jaunes. What he thought was an intelligent and modern economic policy, but which in fact was a sort of a Thatcher revisited decades afterwards, after Thatcher. But this has exploded because we're back to more fiscal deficit because of what he accepted from the Gilets jaunes. So really, but so what you have in France is a kind of a press or media cover-up of the situation. a very dangerous situation, because what you see on television, what you read in the papers, has very little to do with what is actually happening. And the information system is in fact dividing. See, I'm in a very good position to say this, because there was a time when I was son of the establishment, and I worked for papers, but as you reminded, I'm the son of a great journalist, and I spent most of my life being interviewed by, well, most weeklies or dailies without any problem. And now, under Macron, I'm an outcast. I mean, I no longer have access to the public radio system or TV system and so on. But it doesn't seem to matter, because we now have the internet and videos, interview, talks, which are sort of online and so on. And I'm, well, people know me much more than they used to know me. So, which means that we have a completely divided information system. It's we've lost a great part of what was left of our industrial system. The standards of living are going down. The party system has disintegrated. France, as a nation, is disintegrating, but perhaps these are the conditions, in Macron's view, to the preconditions for saving Europe. But you must really be a believer, really of faith. It must be believing such a thing would require the kind of intensity of belief people had in St. Andrews in the days of the Reformation.
Those were the good days, and actually it's a good transition there to the last question before our esteemed audience can now intervene. I mean, the Scots voted clearly against Brexit, but in an interview with the website, Atlantico...
Yes, that's one of the last things where I can express myself, because I have a friend there.
You have a friend in Atlantico. Your message to them was, dinna fash yoursel, right?
That was plain showing off.
Will Brexit not so fash the Scots that it will cause the breakup of Britain?
Yes, well...
Okay, that's the answer, is it? Oh, sorry, continue.
It's, well, in those days, I only had the notion that what was, well, the European Union, or belonging to the European Union, is what contributes to the disintegration of nations. And of course, it was, in my view, it was belonging to the European Union that helped, or, well, at least partially produced Scottish nationalism. Because if you're in a state of mind where the in thing is to say that France will no longer exist, that the UK is headed for dissolution within something larger than itself, you've got the preconditions for the emergence of regional nationalism. That's one thing. Another thing is that as soon as, well, if that was a continental fantasy at one point, that Scotland would get away from the UK to remain with the European Union. But I think it's whatever your level or whatever the intensity of your Scottish feelings, you will soon realize that if you stop being ruled from London, this will not mean being ruled from Edinburgh, but this will mean being ruled from Berlin or Dublin, which is not, well, I want to imagine that this is not acceptable from the Scottish point of view. But since then, I came across the results of the detailed results of the referendum on Scottish independence. And the result in social, economic, or educational terms, if I read them correctly, do not fit with the Brexit conflict, because the working class voted for independence in Scotland, and the middle classes voted, for the first time, voted Remain in the UK. It seems that the middle classes all want to remain where they are, whether in the UK or whether in the EU. They do not seem to be revolutionary at all. So there's no fit, you see. They're multi-conservatives in terms of national belonging. So it doesn't. So I maintain that if I had to make a prediction, and even if Brexit in the end succeeds, which it will, I think, and if I was taking part in one of these games you have on television, you see, and you're supposed to make a guess. So you say, well, Remain or endless discussion or no deal Brexit, you see. I think I would vote for a no deal Brexit quite soon, because and this is not, although the British electorate, and although you've got this completely schizophrenic situation between Leavers and Remainers and so on, and although you can't reach a decision, I mean, keeping, now I will be talking about the French and the Germans, keeping the British within the Union would be keeping problems forever within the Union. So whether in or out, the Union is doomed. Whether the British are in or out the Union. And so the tendency now is to let's get over this, because and this is very much, well, officially this is very much the French attitude. But again, this is when I read I've stopped reading debates in Britain about the Brexit. It's getting too complex for me, and I've given up. I think many people here must be in the same state of mind and so on. But what is fascinating to me is that the people do not seem to realize the underlying, the real forces and the real values behind or below, or the driving forces and values. One, that remaining would be a mortal blow to liberal democracy, because the British would behave like the French, you see, So we have a referendum, but it doesn't count. This would be becoming truly continental in their non-democratic traditions, and that would be dramatic. And people do not seem to, Remainers do not seem to realize that remaining or getting rid of the Brexit referendum would really be to to abandon or get out or an extraordinary liberal national tradition. They do not seem to realize the deep meaning of this. And another thing, perhaps this will come in the next few days, but I was, we drank too much yesterday evening.
Yes.
Together.
Can you cut that from the final version?
Yes, and so I had woke up early with a headache, so I watched the BBC.
As you do.
So to make things worse, and there we had the truth at last. Now we're getting close to the moment, the real moment when things will be decided. And now they were not talking about the European Union. They were talking about May, Merkel, and Macron. That's so. They were talking about Britain or the UK. They were talking about Germany, and they were talking about France. And just like old times, the power conflict, and this is I'm so sorry for the Remainers. Of course, I admit that it must be difficult to accept the will of the people, of less educated people. This must be really painful. I mean, democracy can be painful, but they do not seem to be painful. Is that they do not seem to realize that refusing the will of the people will be accepting the will of Germany, because of course it's the German-French association is a good cop, bad cop thing. You see, the Germans are rather mild, they speak little, and the French, of course, speak loudly and want the British out, you see. But it's, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but so it's a good cop, bad cop thing. But correct me if I'm wrong, usually the good cop is the boss, you see. And so the British, or the Remainers, perhaps the Leavers as well, do not seem to realize that renouncing or giving up on Brexit will simply be submitting to Germany.
Okay, so in the name of liberal democracy, I'll open it to the floor. We have till 6:30. Are there any comments or questions?
And please forgive me, but I would be much more horrible in France.
Andy?
When I was listening to you, I was rather reminded of two comments that were, well, two discourses, two discourse that have been a little bit under the radar, but are still very important. And one of them is the idea of Yanis Varoufakis, who started off being absolutely convinced that Britain should leave, because otherwise Britain was going to be bullied and treated like vermin by the EU. And he's now changed his mind and said we should work for a progressive change within the EU. And he's never really defined for me what exactly that would look like, but it would be something towards your idea of l'Europe des nations, but also l'Europe de la classe ouvrière, I suppose. You know.
But that's...
Well, that's one, so I'll ask you about that one. And then the other rather interesting current of opinion, which comes from a rather surprising source to me anyway, was I read a very interesting interview in the FT with George Soros, who is not normally associated with the idea of being anti-European. I mean, for example, he's attacked virulently by the anti-Semitic right in Eastern Europe, etc. Trump, you name it. And he, right at the end of this interview, which was a very interesting interview, lunch with the FT, he said, the real problem for me is that the European Union now reminds me of the last years of the Soviet Union, an institutional structure which is about to collapse. And he said, and that's the problem for me with all of this discussion about Brexit or whatever, that he rather echoed what you were saying about this thing is all about to collapse anyway, so in a sense Brexit is irrelevant. So, is
yes, but
he's got a point, or a
no, I would agree with Souls, who is, well, has to be realistic. Varoufakis is on a very, in my view, in a sort of very traditional course. You see, you start opposing Europe, Brussels, or the Germans, or the French, and you end up talking and dreaming about a different Europe. It's what Mélenchon in France, that's what he's done, and even the Front National, now called the Rassemblement National, is start talking about a different Europe, an association of all Eurosceptics. But what experience or what the past tells us is that when people start talking about a different Europe, but organizing a different Europe, it simply means that they've given up on everything. Because Europe is so complex as a system. With 27, well, officially, 27, or 28, I can't even remember, nations, and with a sort of a hidden center in Germany plus France, as a sort of minor or junior partner, that it's that changing things is impossible. You see, even the Federalists are unbelievable, because they will say, so now we've reached a point where nothing works in Europe. I mean, outside of Germany, and I'm not even certain that the Germans are not paying a very heavy price for their unwanted or unplanned power. That's the and so, well, pro-Europeans trying to hide their powerlessness and their lack of ideas, well, ask for a federal Europe. You see, but there, I was telling you, we already have a federal Europe. We have a center, Berlin, and nothing can change. You see, nothing can change. So as soon if a politician on the continent, or perhaps soon, if Brexit fails in the UK, start talking about a different Europe, take it as a certain, as an indication that he's given up on everything. It's but Soros is more reasonable than comparing the EU with the Soviet Union is a pretty good comparison, because we've reached a state of paralysis and nothing can move, and we are just well, this is where I see things. I'm just wondering whether what will the where from? What will be the where will the final element of disruption come from?
The catalyst.
The
Catalyst.
Yes, the Catholics are. So if I'm in completely unorthodox or non-politically correct mood, I'll say, well, the Poles will do it. You see, the Poles are so good at disorganizing things. I remember a discussion with Dominique de Villepin. It was shortly after the great moment of love between France, Germany, and Russia, with Putin and Schröder and Chirac. And one moment, well, I'm only reporting what Villepin told me, so no second source to confirm, but it's so reasonable that I have to believe it's true. And so at one moment, Putin said, of course we're having a difficult time these days, but I have a consolation. You'll have to take care of the Poles. See? And so when Tusk got nominated, I said, the end is coming.
Any other comments or questions for Emmanuel Todd? Freya?
Just wanted to say that thank you for coming. It was really, really interesting because I think the general consensus and the general conversation that we have at uni is that Brexit is a really negative thing. So just the fact that your whole approach is that, what I've learned from today is that for you Brexit is, like, the EU doesn't represent democracy, it's the opposite of that. So it's always just funny because whenever you're saying that you don't understand Remainers, I think, like, coming in here, I think I would say that most of the people in here are Remainers. Like, it's making an assumption. But whenever we have conversations in class regarding Brexit, it's always that, oh, it's a ridiculous thing for us to even consider leaving. So,
yes, but
it's just really
this is no problem for me because I said a few words about education and higher education, and to me the drive to against democracy doesn't come from capitalism, as most left-wingers would say. I think the heart of the anti-democracy movement is academia.
yeah.
You see, that's where the new hierarchical system is organized, produced, and reproduced. You see, I would say the same in France. It's a universal thing. You see, and so academia, and academia is not. It's no longer a small thing. I mean, the universities are in advanced societies are massive, strategic, and their basic values are not liberty and equality. Their goal is to rank people, and their structure is basically oligarchical and bureaucratic. So it's absolutely normal that 70% of people in Cambridge voted Remain, and I wouldn't expect anything different in any, but this would apply to France also. You see, and what's difficult for us, because we have this old historical habit of thinking that education is left-wing, education is progress, you see. education is good in itself. But if you accept the vision of history I sort of suggested at the beginning of this discussion, that we've reached the point where classification of individuals in terms of academic or educational achievement is central to the life of advanced society. It is simply normal that the universities, academia, are just at the heart of the anti-democratic movement. I'm a very optimistic person.
That's great. Any other comments? I think, yes, yeah, you had.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting to learn about family systems and how...
A little louder, I'm a little hard of hearing, you see. Age.
So I had a question first about what you said when you were studying the family values and systems and differences in different European countries. And you said that the differences kind of showed you that the European project was doomed to failure. But for example, you've shown yourself that in France, inside of France, so southwest France is more of a STEM family structure, and then Parisian kind of region is more of a nuclear family. So, in a sense, every political structure has to work through compromise of different kind of regional values, and in France, for example, the repression of provincial values and languages. So more than just the failure of the project, it's more of like a restructuring or transformation from nation-based to continental political system that compromises between different national kind of values. That would be one of my first remark, and maybe you can answer that. The second one would be, I thought it was quite interesting that you approached Brexit the same way you approach Brexit, because obviously your main issue with Brexit is, with the EU, is the way that France, for example, does not have control on its currency, and so that's kind of the base of destruction of democracy in the EU. But the UK was neither in the Schengen zone nor in the Eurozone, so there was neither the issue of the control of the currency or the control of the border. So Brexit was kind of, the campaign was on different terms, and terms that were actually fracturing the British society, and it's difficult to approach it the same way. They give it more than they did.
Okay, so as for regional differences, it's true that in France it's not only that we have regional differences in France, that we have provinces with opposing value systems. It's in a way France is organized against itself. You see, the periphery is hierarchical, Catholic, or used to be hierarchical, Catholic, with a lot of STEM family, and the center including the Mediterranean, so say liberal, egalitarian, and so on. But the unification of France, the building of the French system, took centuries, and centuries of war. I mean, it started with the Croisade des Albigeois, that sort of broke the southwest. And then we had the war, the expulsion of the Protestants, which were also much better represented in the southwest, because there is a connection between the STEM family and Protestantism. And then we had the war in the Vendée during the revolution. And this means, I think the French got reconciled in, rarely reconciled as a nation during the First World War. That was the time when Frenchmen considered themselves Frenchmen and not much else. So there's, well, I hope you cannot imagine a similar solution for Europe. That was tried. Napoleon tried it. Hitler tried it, and it didn't work. So there's no option there, you see. While wars between European states failed to achieve that kind of unity. What was the second question?
About Brexit and approaching it the same way we approach.
Yes, as far as I can remember, yes, of course, the UK has retained a national currency. I'm not forgetting the Bank of Scotland. I don't want any trouble there. And Britain doesn't belong to the Schengen area, so there's, well, Britain is almost independent in a way, or almost, but there's freedom of movement within the EU, and as far as I can remember, the presence of too many Poles. Again, I'm not anti-Polish. This would be a mistake. I'm not obsessed by Poland, but the presence of too many Poles was one of the determinants in the vote for Brexit. But if so, getting out of the European Union really means being able to exert some kind of control over immigration from the continent, which in my view is something perfectly legitimate. You see, I'm well known in France as the defender of Frenchmen with Muslim origins and so on. And my son-in-law is called Mustafa. So, and I have 3 grandchildren which are also of Algerian descent. So I have a pure heart on these matters. You see, but no border ideologues do not seem to realize that a democracy is also a people that self-organizes to take decision, and this implies a territory and the freedom to decide on who comes into it or who doesn't, quantity and so on. So border control, in my view, is part of the democracy. Is part of democracy, and I think that there's in everything that's happening, there's a great deal of non-consciousness or false consciousness, because words are losing their meaning. I was talking about Europe, and I'm sure that the no-border people think they're wonderful universalists, good democrats, and so on. But if you spend a few minutes thinking a little about what a democracy actually is, a well-functioning actually is, you must admit that the no-border movement is radically anti-democratic, because what it aspires to is imperial chaos, and that's the very opposite of democracy. And in my last book, I have a long and not so paradoxical development on the xenophobic origins of democracy. You see, it's the beginning of democracy is not egalitarian values of the French type. It's just national independence. Athens was widely xenophobic. You see, the US in the early days were, well, racist and so on. And so when I make jokes, well, perhaps I didn't try that one in public in France, said that too much xenophobia, a great deal of xenophobia, gets you away from democracy, but a little xenophobia gets you back to democracy.
Okay, so thanks very much. We've run out of time. Thanks very much for coming along. I think they were good. St Andrews, thank you to our guest, Emmanuel Todd.